Part 5, sorry. McGovern was back, slouched in his favorite chair on the porch. He was looking at something up the street and didn't immediately turn when his upstairs neighbor stepped outside. Ralph followed his gaze and saw a blue step van parked at the curb half a block up from Harris Avenue, on the red apple side of the street. Dairy Medical Services was printed across the rear doors in large white letters. "Hi, Bill," Ralph said, and dropped into his own chair. The rocker where Lois Chess always sat when she came over stood between them. A little twilight breeze had sprung up, delightfully cool after the heat of the afternoon, and the empty rocker moved lazily back and forth at its whim. "Hi," Bill said, glancing over at Ralph. He started to look away, then did a double take. "Man, you better start pinning up the bags under your eyes. You're going to be stepping on them pretty soon if you don't." Ralph thought this was supposed to come out sounding like one of the caustic little bon mots for which McGovern was famous along the street, but the look in his eyes was one of genuine concern. "It's been a bitch of a day," he said. He told Bill about Helen's call, editing out things he thought she might be uncomfortable with Bill's knowing. He had never been one of her favorite people. "Glad she's okay," Bill said. "I'll tell you something, Ralph. You impressed me today, marching up the street that way like Gary Cooper in High Noon. Maybe it was insane, but it was also pretty cool." He paused. "To tell you the truth, I was a little in awe of you." This was the second time in 15 minutes that someone had come close to calling Ralph a hero. It made him uncomfortable. I was too mad at him to realize how dumb I was being until later. "Where you been, Bill? I tried to call you a little while ago." "I took a walk out to the extension," McGovern said, "trying to cool my engine off a little, I guess. I felt headachy and sick to my stomach ever since Laydeck, Johnny, and Chris took it away." Ralph nodded. "Me too." "Really?" McGovern looked surprised and a little skeptical. "Really?" Ralph said with a faint smile. "Anyway, Fade Chapin was at the picnic area where those old lags usually hang out during the hot weather, and he coaxed me into a game of chess." Sorry, folks. What a piece of work the guy is, Ralph. He thinks he's the reincarnation of Roy Lopez, but he plays chess more like Soupy Sales, and he never shuts up. "Faye's all right, though," Ralph said quietly. "Bill seemed not to have heard him, and that creepy old Dorrance Marsteller was out there," he went on. "If we're old, then he's a fossil. He just stands there with a fence between the picnic area and the airport with a book of poetry in his hands, watching the planes take off and land. Does he really read those books he carries around, do you think? Or are they just props?" "Good question," Bill said, but he was thinking about the word McGovern had employed to describe Dorrance. Creepy. It wasn't one he would have used himself, but there could be no doubt that old Dorrance was one of life's originals. He wasn't senile, at least Ralph didn't think he was. It was more as if the few things he said were the product of a mind that was slightly skewed and perceptions that were slightly bent. He remembered that Dor had been there that day last summer when Ed ran into the guy in the pickup truck, John Tandy, and the time that thought that Dorrance's arrival had added the final screwy touch to the festivities, and Dorrance had said something funny. Ralph tried to recall what it was and couldn't. Bill was gazing back up the street where a whistling young man in a gray coverall had just come out of the house in front of which the medical services step van was parked. This young man, looking all of 24, and as if he hadn't needed a single medical service in his entire life, was rolling a dolly with a long green tank strapped to it. "That's the empty," Bill said. "You missed him taking in the full one." Excuse me. A second young man, also dressed in a coverall, stepped out through the front door of the small house, which combined yellow paint and deep pink trim in an unfortunate manner. He stood on the stoop for a moment, hand on the doorknob, apparently speaking to someone inside. Then he pulled the door shut and ran lithely down the walk. He was in time to help his colleague lift the dolly, with the tank still strapped to it in the back of the van. "Oxygen?" Ralph asked. Bill nodded. For May Loker? Bill nodded again, watching as the medical services workers slammed the doors of the step van and then stood behind them talking quietly in the fading light. I went to grammar school and junior high with May Loker. Way out in Cardville, home of the brave and land of the cows. There were only 5 of us in our graduating class. Back in those days, she was known as a hot ticket, and fellas like me were known as a wee bit lavender, quote-unquote. In that amusingly antique era, gay was how you described your Christmas tree after it was decorated. Ralph stood and looked down at his hands, uncomfortable and tongue-tied. Of course he knew that Bill was a homosexual, known it for years, but Bill had never spoken of it out loud until this evening. Ralph wished he could have saved it for another day. Preferably one when Ralph himself wasn't feeling as if most of his brains had been replaced with goose down. That was about 1,000 years ago, McGovern said. Who would have thought we'd both wash up on the shores of Harris Avenue? It's emphysema she has, isn't that right? I think that's what I heard. Yep, one of those diseases that keep on giving. Getting old is certainly no job for sissies, isn't it? No, it's not, Ralph said. And then his mind brought the truth of it home with sudden force. It was Carolyn he thought of and the terror he had felt when he came squelching into the apartment in soaked sneakers and had seen her lying half in and half out of the kitchen, exactly where he had stood during most of his conversation with Helen, in fact. Facing Ed Deebno had been nothing compared to the terror he had felt at that moment, where he had been sure that Carolyn was dead. I can remember when they just brought May oxygen once every 2 weeks or so, McGovern said. Now they come every Monday and Thursday evening like clockwork. I go over and see her when I can. Sometimes I read to her. The most boring women's magazine bullshit you can imagine, and sometimes we just sit and talk. She says it feels as if her lungs are filling up with seaweed. It won't be long now. They'll come one day, and instead of loading an empty oxygen tank into the back of that wagon, they'll load me in. They'll take her off to Dairy Home, and that'll be the end. Was it cigarettes? Ralph asked. Bill favored him with a look so alien to that lean, mild face that it took Ralph several moments to realize it was contempt. May Parole Loker never smoked a cigarette in her whole life. What she's paying off is 20 years in the dye house at a mill in Corina and another 20 working at the picker at the mill in Newport. It's cotton wool and nylon she's trying to breathe through, not seaweed. The 2 young men from Dairy Medical Services got into their van and drove away. Maine's the northeastern anchor of Appalachia, Raph. A lot of people don't realize that, but it's true. And May's dying of an Appalachian disease. The doctors call it textile lung. That's a shame. I guess she means a lot to you. McGovern, Bill laughed ruefully. Nah. I visit her because she happens to be the last visible piece of my misspent youth. Sometimes I read to her and I always manage to get down 1 or 2 of her dry oatmeal cookies. But that's about as far as it goes. My concern is safely selfish, I assure you. Safely selfish, Ralph thought. What a really odd phrase. What a really McGovern phrase. Never mind me, McGovern said. The question on the lips of Americans everywhere is what we're going to do about you, Ralph. Whiskey didn't work, did it? No, Ralph said. I'm afraid it didn't. To make a particularly apropos pun, did you give it a fair shot? Ralph nodded. Well, you have to do something about the bags under your eyes or you'll never land the lovely Lois. Bill studied Ralph's facial response to this and sighed. Not that funny, huh? Nope, it's been a long day. Sorry. It's okay. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the comings and goings on their part of Harris Avenue. 3 little girls were playing hopscotch in the Red Apples parking lot across the street. Mrs. Burns stood nearby, straight as a sentry, watching them. A boy with his Red Sox hat cap turned around backward went past. Bobbing to the beat of his Walkman headset. 2 kids were tossing a frisbee back and forth in front of Lois's house. A dog barked. Somewhere a woman was yelling for her son Sam to get his sister and come back inside. It was just the usual street life serenade, no more and no less. But to Ralph, it all seemed strangely false. He supposed it was because he had gotten so used to seeing Harris Avenue empty lately. He turned to Bill and said, "You know what was just about the first thing I thought of when I saw you in the Red Apple parking lot this afternoon, in spite of everything that had been going on?" Bill shook his head. "I wonder where the hell your hat was. The Panama. You look very strange to me without it. Naked and ancient almost. So come clean. Where'd you stash the lid, son?" McGovern touched the top of his head, where the remaining strands of his baby fine white hair combed carefully left to right across his pink skull. "I don't know," he said. "I missed it this morning. I almost always remember to drop it on the table by the front door when I come in. But it's not there. I suppose I put it down somewhere else this time, and the exact locale slipped my mind for the nonce. Give me another few years, and I'll be wandering around in my underpants, running around in my boxers because I can't remember where I left my pants. All part of the wonderful aging experience, right, Ralph?" Ralph nodded and smiled, thinking to himself that of all the elderly people he knew, and he knew at least 36 on a casual walk in the park, hi, how you doing basis, Bill McGovern bitched the most about getting on in years. He seemed to regard his vanished youth and recently departed middle age as a general would regard a couple of soldiers who desert on the eve of a big battle. He wasn't about to say such a thing, however. Everyone had their little eccentricities. Being theatrically morbid about growing old was simply one of Bill's. "Did I say something funny?" Bill asked. "Pardon? You were smiling, so I thought I must have said something funny." He sounded a bit touchy, especially for a man so fond of ribbing his upstairs neighbor about the pretty widow down the street. But Ralph reminded himself it had been a long day for Bill, too. "I wasn't thinking about you at all," Ralph said. "I was thinking about how Carolyn used to say practically the same thing. That getting old was like getting a bad dessert at the end of a really fine meal." This was at least half a lie. Carolyn had made the simile, but she had used it to describe her brain tumor that was killing her, not her life as a senior citizen. She hadn't been all that senior anyway, 64 when she died, and until the last 6 or 8 weeks of her life, she claimed to feel only half of that on most days. Across from them, the 3 girls who had been playing hopscotch approached the curb, looked both ways for traffic, then joined hands and ran across the street laughing. For just a moment, they looked at him as if they were surrounded by a glow, a nimbus that illuminated their cheeks and brows and laughing eyes like some strange clarifying St. Elmo's fire. A little frightened, Ralph squeezed his eyes shut and then popped them open again. And the gray envelope he'd imagined around the trio of girls was gone, which was a relief, but he had to get some sleep soon. He had to. "Ralph," Bill's voice seemed to be coming from the far end of the porch, although he hadn't moved. "You alright?" "Sure," Ralph said. "Thinking about Ed and Helen, that's all. Did you have any idea how screwy he was getting, Bill?" Bill shook his head decisively. "None whatsoever," he said, "and although I saw bruises on Helen from time to time, I always believed her stories about them. I hate to consider myself a tremendously gullible person, but I may have to reassess my thinking on that score." "What do you think will happen to him? Any predictions?" Bill sighed and touched the top of his head with his fingertips, feeling for the missing Panama without realizing it. "You know me, Ralph. I'm a cynic from a long line of those motherfuckers. I think it's very rare for ordinary human conflicts to resolve themselves the way they do on TV. In reality, they just keep coming back, turning in diminishing circles until they finally disappear. Except disappearing isn't really what they do. They dry up like mud puddles in the sun." Bill paused and added, "And most of them leave the same scummy residue behind." "Jesus," Ralph said. "That is cynical." Bill shrugged. "Most retired teachers are cynical, Ralph. We see them come in so young and so strong, so convinced it's going to be different for them, and we see them make their messes and then paddle around in them, just as our parents and grandparents did. What I think is that Helen will go back to him, Ed will do okay for a while, and then he'll beat her up again and she'll leave again. It's just like one of those sappy country western songs they have on the juke out at Nikki's lunch. And some people have to listen to that song a long, long time before they decide they don't want to hear it anymore. Helen's a bright young woman, though. I think one more verse is all she'll ever need. One verse might be all she'll ever get," Ralph said quietly. "We're not talking about some drunk husband coming on Friday night and beating his wife up because he lost his paycheck in a poker game and she dared bitch about it." "I know," Bill said, "but you asked for my opinion and I gave it to you. I think Ellen's going to need one more go around before she can bring herself to call it off. And even then, they're apt to keep on bumping up against each other. It's a pretty small town. He paused, squinting down the street. "Oh, look!" he said, hoisting his left brow. "Our Lois! She walks in beauty like the night." Ralph gave him an impatient look, which Bill either did not see or pretended not to notice. He got up, once again touching the tips of his fingers to the place where the Panama was, and then down the steps to meet her on the walk. "Lois!" McGovern cried, dropping to one knee before her and extending his hand theatrically. "Would that our lives might be untied by the starry bonds of love! Put your feet to mine, and let me whirl you away to climes various in the golden car of my affection." "Gee, are you talking about a honeymoon or a one-night stand?" Lois asked, smiling uncertainly. Ralph poked McGovern in the back. "Get up, fool," he said, and took the small bag Lois was carrying. He looked inside and saw 3 cans of beer. Bill got to his feet. "Sorry, Lois," he said. "It was a combination of summer twilight and your beauty. I plead temporary insanity, in other words." Lois smiled at him, then turned to Ralph. "I just heard what happened, and I hurried over as fast as I could. I was in Ludlow all afternoon playing nickel-time poker with the girls." Ralph didn't have to look at McGovern to know his left eyebrow, the one that said, "Poker with the girls? How wonderfully perfectly our Lois," would be hoisted to its maximum altitude. "Is Helen all right?" "Yes," Ralph said. "Well, maybe not exactly all right. They're keeping her in the hospital overnight, but she's not in danger." "And the baby?" "She's fine. She's staying with a friend of Helen's." "Well, come up on the porch, you two, and tell me all about it." She linked one arm through Bill's, the other through Ralph's, and led them back up the walk. They mounted the porch steps that way, like 2 elderly musketeers, with the woman whose affections they had vied for in the days of their youth held safely between them. And as Lois sat down in her rocking chair, the streetlights went on along Pearlers Avenue, glimmering in the dusk like a double rope of pearls.